There is something quietly magnificent about driving through the American countryside and catching sight of an old silo standing against the horizon, weathered, narrow, impossibly tall for its base, looking almost like a lighthouse built for a sea of wheat. Most people pass by without a second thought, maybe snapping a photo for the aesthetics of rural nostalgia. But those structures were not accidents of tradition, and they were certainly not arbitrary choices made by farmers who simply liked the look of tall things. Every dimension, every curve, every inch of that narrow cylindrical form was the product of centuries of accumulated wisdom, agricultural intelligence encoded in concrete and stone long before any engineer sat down with a blueprint and called it science. The story of the grain silo is, at its core, the story of human survival. And to understand why those old structures were built precisely the way they were, you have to go back much further than the 19th century American Midwest. You have to go back to the very beginning of settled civilization, to the first moment a human being looked at a harvest and asked a question that changed everything. How do we keep this alive through winter? That problem, preserving a surplus of food, is arguably the single challenge that made civilization itself possible. Without a reliable method of storing grain, there could be no cities, no standing armies, no trade routes, no sustained political structures of any kind. Everything historians identify as the foundation of organized human society depended, at its root, on keeping grain from rotting before people had a chance to eat it. Early storage solutions were crude by any contemporary measure. Ancient peoples dug pits into the earth, lined them with clay or stone, and buried their grain beneath the surface. The logic was intuitive. Underground temperatures remained more stable throughout the year, shielded from scorching sun and freezing nights. Civilizations from the ancient Near East to the Mediterranean relied on these subterranean granaries for thousands of years, and they worked reasonably well. But they carried a weakness no clay lining could fully address: moisture. Grain is essentially a living thing, a collection of seeds carrying the biochemical potential for germination. When moisture levels rise even slightly above the threshold of safety, that biological potential activates in catastrophic ways. Mold takes hold, bacteria multiply. What was once a carefully gathered stockpile becomes a warm, damp, decomposing mass capable of spreading contamination through an entire stored supply in a matter of days. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you are watching from. We have got viewers tuning in from all across the country, and we genuinely want to know what part of America still has grain country running through its backroads. The moisture problem facing early grain farmers was not simply about rain getting in from above, it came from within the grain itself. Every kernel stored in a pile generates a measurable amount of heat and moisture as a natural byproduct of its own biological processes. What plant scientists would later call cellular respiration. In a wide, flat pile, this continuously released moisture has nowhere efficient to go. It accumulates within the interior of the mass, creating pockets of warmth and humidity that function as perfect incubators for the very organisms that destroy grain. The more densely packed the grain, and the wider the storage space, the more pronounced this self-destructive cycle becomes. Farmers throughout history observed the pattern without fully understanding its science. They knew that grain stored in wide, low structures spoiled faster. They knew that ventilation helped. What they needed was a shape that could perform much of that ventilation work passively, without constant human intervention. The answer that emerged from centuries of hard-won experimentation was vertical storage. A tall, narrow column of grain behaves fundamentally differently from a wide, shallow bed, and the physics that explain why are not complicated once they are laid out. In a narrow column, no portion of the stored grain is ever far from the outer wall, and that wall, whether stone, timber or concrete, acts as a conduit for the movement of heat and moisture outward and upward. The column shape promotes what engineers would later call convective airflow. Warm, moisture-laden air generated by the grain's respiration rises naturally toward the top, while cooler, drier air from the lower sections cycles inward. This passive circulation, driven by nothing more than the natural tendency of warm air to rise, keeps the grain mass from developing the dangerous hotspots and moisture concentrations that cause spoilage. The physics work around the clock without any energy input whatsoever. The tall, narrow form also addressed a second major threat that flat storage could never solve: pest infiltration. Rodents, insects and grain-eating birds pursue stored grain with a persistence that farmers found exhausting to combat. In a wide, low structure, every inch of accessible surface represents a potential entry point. A tall cylinder dramatically reduces the ratio of exposed surface area to total stored volume. The grain piled high in a narrow tower is simply harder to reach, harder to contaminate, and far easier to monitor. Height was not a matter of pride or aesthetics. It was a calculated defense. American silo culture began taking meaningful shape in the mid-19th century, though the structures now dotting rural landscapes are the descendants of far older European and Middle Eastern traditions. The earliest American grain towers were built of wood, often in polygonal plans rather than true cylinders, and they were modest in height compared to what would follow. These timber silos had serious limitations that made themselves known quickly: wood warps, cracks and rots under seasonal moisture and the pressure of thousands of pounds of stored grain. Joints between planks were never truly airtight, and a tall wooden column under full grain load can split with almost no warning. Farmers accepted these limitations because alternatives were scarce, but the search for better materials was relentless. We are about a third of the way through this history, and before we go deeper, if you are learning something here that genuinely surprised you, leave a thumbs up on the video right now. That small action tells us more than you might realize about what kind of content deserves to keep being made. The transition to stone masonry and later to poured concrete transformed everything. A properly built concrete silo could stand for generations with minimal structural attention. It was impermeable to both moisture and pests in ways timber never achieved. It could be built taller without comparable risk of failure. And stone and concrete possess thermal mass, the capacity to absorb and release heat slowly, that buffers against the temperature extremes that accelerate biological deterioration in stored grain. A well-built concrete silo on a sweltering Midwestern afternoon holds a significantly more stable internal temperature than the air outside. That stability is enormously beneficial to the grain within, suppressing the metabolic activity of the kernels themselves and the microbial populations always waiting for an opportunity. The narrow diameter was not incidental to the height. The two dimensions were deeply and mathematically interdependent. A wide cylinder filled to considerable height creates enormous internal pressure at its base. Grain under those conditions behaves almost like a slow fluid, pushing outward against the walls in patterns that vary with depth, moisture content, temperature, and grain type. The narrow diameter kept those lateral forces within manageable bounds, and the circular cross-section distributed stress efficiently around the entire perimeter, allowing walls to be built thinner relative to their height than any wider design could permit. There is a mathematical elegance to the cylinder that builders understood intuitively long before calculus could describe it. A circle encloses the maximum possible area for any given perimeter, meaning that for any fixed quantity of wall material, a circular plan contains more grain than any other geometric form, and the circle has no corners. Corners in structural engineering are liabilities of the most persistent kind. They concentrate stress, and they are the first points to fail under sustained loading. Every polygonal silo farmers experimented with across the centuries eventually pointed toward the same conclusion. The cylinder was not one practical option among many. It was the optimal answer to the specific set of physical problems that grain storage presents. Think back to the oldest agricultural structure you have ever seen in person. A barn, a granary, a stone wall on some farm that looked like it predated everything around it. Tell us about it in the comments. Where was it? What did it look like? We are building a map of American agricultural memory down there, and we want your piece of it. The height of the old silos served one more operational function easy to overlook. It created a gravitational advantage in the daily handling of grain. Filling a tall silo required lifting grain to the top, a demanding task in the era before electric conveyors, typically accomplished with horse-powered or steam-driven elevators. But emptying it was effortless by comparison. A discharge opening at the base allowed grain to flow outward under its own weight, controlled by nothing more complex than a hinged gate. This gravity-fed discharge meant that energy invested in loading was recovered in the simplicity of unloading, and the entire stored volume could be moved without additional powered machinery. For farms operating on tight margins with limited labor, which described virtually every family farm in 19th century America, that operational elegance was not a convenient feature. It was a survival mechanism. It is also worth understanding what grain actually does inside these structures, because the silo's geometry was designed to work with it. A filled silo is not simply a passive container holding inert material in a static state. It is a dynamic, shifting, biologically active environment that requires intelligent management even when nothing visible appears to be happening. The grain settles progressively over days and weeks as individual kernels find their natural geometric packing arrangement, sometimes generating pressure differentials capable of cracking improperly reinforced walls. Temperature gradients within the mass drive slow but measurable internal air currents that redistribute moisture in ways it took farmers generations to learn to anticipate and counter. Fungal populations and bacterial colonies exist in every grain supply in small but ever-present quantities, held in check by the right combination of temperature, moisture, and airflow, but always positioned to proliferate rapidly if conditions shift even slightly in their favor. Managing all of that biological activity within a static structure required a design that worked with the grain's natural tendencies rather than in ignorance of them. And the tall, narrow cylinder achieved that alignment through nothing more than its proportions. As the 20th century arrived, university agricultural departments and professional engineers began applying formal analytical tools to the structures that farmers had built by instinct and inherited knowledge. What they found, almost without exception, was that the empirical solutions developed through generations of trial and painful loss held up remarkably well under rigorous scrutiny. The rule that experienced grain handlers had followed for decades: narrow the diameter, maximize the height, seal the entry points, and trust the shape to do the work, was now validated by thermodynamic measurements, structural load calculations, and detailed microbial studies. Aeration systems were developed to actively drive air through stored grain, supplementing the passive convection the tall cylinder naturally promoted. Temperature and moisture monitoring became standard practice. But the fundamental proportions of the silo remained largely unchanged through all of these refinements, because the fundamental physics justifying those proportions had not changed and could not change. The regional variation in silo design across the continental United States tells a secondary story about how local environmental conditions shaped local engineering solutions within the shared framework of the cylinder. In the wetter climates of the upper Midwest, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Michigan, silos were built with particular attention to sealing and drainage because the ambient humidity through spring and fall months already pushed stored grain dangerously close to the threshold at which spoilage becomes inevitable. Builders in those regions developed construction techniques that minimized seams, used lime-based interior coatings, and ensured that roof drainage directed water well away from the base. In the drier reaches of the Great Plains, the concern shifted toward temperature extremes rather than persistent moisture. The brutal contrast between January cold and August heat in Kansas or South Dakota required structures with greater thermal mass and sometimes supplemental exterior insulation to moderate the seasonal swings that could crack grain kernels and accelerate deterioration. Along the Gulf Coast, where both heat and humidity operate simultaneously at levels that challenged every preservation method, many producers ultimately relied more heavily on rapid market turnover than on long-term storage. Each region developed its own architectural vocabulary and material preferences, but the underlying geometry, tall, narrow, round, remained the shared answer to the shared problem of keeping grain alive. We are nearly at the end of this story, and before we finish, share this video with one person who would never expect to spend time thinking about grain silos, because those are exactly the people who end up leaving the most thoughtful comments below. Pass it along, and let's see what happens. The gradual decline of the traditional tall silo in contemporary agriculture tells a story as much about economics as engineering. Modern grain storage has largely migrated toward enormous horizontal warehouses with mechanical aeration fans, computer-controlled climate management, and electronic monitoring distributed throughout the stored mass at dozens of points. These buildings hold quantities of grain that dwarf any tower silo ever constructed, and their horizontal configuration integrates seamlessly with the mechanized handling systems that define commercial operations today. The passive ventilation advantages of the tall cylinder are replicated artificially by powerful electric fans managed by algorithms running around the clock. The gravity discharge that made the tower silo so operationally elegant is replaced by auger conveyors and pneumatic transfer systems that move grain faster and with greater positional precision than any hinged gate could achieve. In an era of cheap energy and near unlimited mechanical capacity, the economic logic of the traditional silo cannot compete with the scale and throughput advantages of its flat storage successor. What has been lost is more than nostalgia. The old silos represented a form of agricultural intelligence that was free to operate in perpetuity. They required no electricity to maintain proper internal conditions. They needed no scheduled replacement components. A well-constructed concrete silo in sound condition could preserve grain for decades, potentially a century, without any energy input beyond the labor of filling it each season. The passive physics of its geometry did the work continuously and reliably. In the economic environment now taking shape, with energy costs rising, supply chains proving fragile, and agricultural resilience becoming a genuine national concern, the engineering logic of the tall, narrow silo looks considerably less like an obsolete curiosity and considerably more like a lesson worth revisiting. The farmers who built these structures, many working without formal education, none with computational tools, most relying on accumulated community knowledge and the hard lessons of failed harvests, were solving optimization problems that modern engineers would recognize and respect immediately. They were maximizing storage volume while minimizing wall material. They were engineering passive thermodynamic management through geometric form alone. They were doing it in stone and timber and eventually concrete, across generations, with sustained observation and practical necessity as their only instruments. The tall, narrow silo standing in a field somewhere in Ohio, Nebraska, or Tennessee is not a monument to the limitations of a pre-scientific era. It is a monument to the kind of intelligence that emerges when people pay close attention to the physical world over a very long period of time, with real consequences riding on the quality of their conclusions. The American countryside is filled with structures that carry far more embedded intelligence than a passing glance suggests. The covered bridge, the dry-laid stone fence, the root cellar cut into a hillside, each is an engineered response to a specific problem, worked out not in a laboratory, but across generations of people for whom failure carried immediate costs. The silo is perhaps the most visually striking of these quiet monuments because its form is so pure, so unambiguous, so clearly the product of a coherent geometric logic rather than any decorative impulse. You cannot look at a tall, narrow silo and mistake it for an aesthetic choice made without functional justification. It looks precisely the way it looks because that shape, and no other, solved the problem it was built to solve. The next time you pass one, whether it stands functional on a working farm or leans slowly at the edge of an abandoned property returning to the earth, take a moment with it. Consider the failed harvests that taught early farmers why wide and flat was wrong. Consider the structural failures that taught subsequent generations why corners concentrate stress. Consider the wet springs and blazing summers that pressed builders toward proportions capable of performing reliably across decades. Consider the generations of observation, of careful attention, of incremental refinement that accumulated into the elegant solution standing before you. That structure is not old in any sense that diminishes it. That structure is wise in every sense that matters.